Sunday afternoon, my wife and I were sitting at the kitchen table. We're on the phone with Disney World to make final payments for our big vacation. And suddenly I felt my stomach drop. The trip was planned, the deposits were paid, grandkids were super excited. And suddenly I realized I might have messed the whole thing up. Not because something catastrophic happened, but because I had tried to be clever. And I neglected to tell my wife what I did. And the part that unsettles me the most, this wasn't some wild, reckless decision, it was autopilot. And I'm starting to realize autopilot might not age very well. So a few days earlier, I had what I thought was a really smart idea. Instead of paying the Disney balance from our straight from our bank account, I moved the money onto our Visa first, planning to use the Visa to pay Disney and then take advantage of travel points and cashback bonus, basically free money. I've done transfers like that before, and I know they sometimes take longer than expected to clear so that, the funds are available. So I should have realized that there was a very real chance that a transfer made on Thursday might not be available for use by the following Tuesday. But I didn't slow down and think it through. My autopilot was just running the next efficient step. And here's the honest truth, I didn't consciously keep it from my wife. I simply forgot to mention it. If a little angel had been on my shoulder and whispered, "Hey, Mark, maybe run this by Sandy," I would have, smacked my forehead and said, "Oh, yeah, that's a good idea." But no angel showed up, and I just did it. Autopilot is fine when you're loading the dishwasher. It's not fine when you're moving around thousands of dollars for a very important reason. So Sunday afternoon comes around, and my wife and I sit down together to make the final payments for the Disney trip. We're doing it as a team, notes in front of us. And that's when we find out the Visa payment I made won't fully clear until Thursday. Problem is, Disney's deadline for final payment was Tuesday. I remember just freezing because now this wasn't some theoretical thing, it was real. My wife, she was justifiably very upset. Not because I tried to get points, but mostly because I hadn't bothered to mention to her that I was going to move that money onto the Visa on Thursday. Rightfully, she felt blindsided. And underneath the frustration, she was scared. Scared like, is this whole trip going to start falling apart before it even begins? And this just isn't some quick reservation, some spur of the moment vacation. It's flights, kids, grandkids, 10 people all together, time off of work, coordination between three families, and very literally a once in a lifetime vacation. And in that moment, I realized I hadn't just created a payment delay, I'd created a trust problem. And what bothered me the most was I already knew big transfers like that can take time. This wasn't new information. It wasn't the first time I've moved money around, but I just didn't slow down long enough to think it all through. But even worse, it never crossed my mind to mention it to Sandy, my wife. Autopilot again. I just kind of get on a path and I just go. So thankfully, Disney was flexible. They extended the deadline by 2 days. The trip is still happening. But that moment at the table, I could feel what it cost. So later that evening, after things had calmed down, my wife said something that hit me harder than the payment issue. She wasn't yelling, she just looked tired. And she said, "I just want the old Mark back." And that stung because she wasn't talking about my Disney fiasco. She was talking about the man who used to pause, the man who thought through implications, that was, the guy that was considerate of being a team, the man who didn't act first and explain later. And the part that hurts, I want that old Mark back too. Not the younger version, just the one who slowed down enough to communicate. But then she did something very gracious. She admitted that she's changed too as she gets older. She acknowledged she's less patient than she used to be. And suddenly the discussion wasn't about blame anymore. It was two people who love each other realizing we're both aging, we're both changing. And if we don't pay attention, little fractures start forming. Not big dramatic ones, but quiet fractures nonetheless. So this isn't the first time I've forgotten to mention something important, made a decision that looked pretty dumb in hindsight. It's not all the time, but it's happening lately more than I'd like. And that forces a question I don't love asking, is this aging? Because I feel mentally competent. I still handle our finances. I still make decisions, but I'm not 45 anymore. And as much as I'd like to believe that I'm just as sharp as ever, honestly, I realize I'm probably not. And that's uncomfortable. For most of my life, being smart and capable was a big part of my identity. Intelligent, mentally sharp, reliable. And aging doesn't take that away overnight. It's a slow softening. And because it's so gradual, you really don't notice it at first. This reminded me of when I realized my mood and sleep were being affected by anxiety. I'll leave a link to it up above here to that video. But the anxiety didn't show up all of a sudden one morning. It was subtle. It was not sleeping very well at night, feeling very restless. During the day, feeling a little more grumpy and irritable. Nothing dramatic until one day I stepped back and thought, you know, this isn't me. This didn't happen overnight. So I talked to my doctor, not because I was falling apart, but because I realized something had slowly built up. And I think aging and, the sharpness part works the same way. It's not that one morning I discover I can't bend over to tie my shoes. It's not one morning I can't remember how the coffee maker works. It's just a very slow creeping in. And because, you still feel like you just trust the autopilot you always have. And so here's where I'm at now with all this. This isn't panic. It's more like guardrails. On the physical side of it, I don't climb Lambert. I don't climb ladders the way I used to. Not because I can't, but because I know I really shouldn't do it. Maybe mental decisions deserve the same humility. Running an idea past my wife isn't weakness, it's respect, but it's also a guardrail to make sure I'm not heading into something stupid. Talking to a doctor wasn't weakness, it was more like maintenance. Maybe wisdom in retirement isn't proving I still have it. Maybe it's recognizing that autopilot doesn't age very well. If I keep trusting autopilot, I'll keep causing small fractures. And those fractures don't show up in a bank account. They show up in sentences like, I just want the old Mark back. So the Disney trip is still happening. Actually, just a few hours ago, we made the final payments. Everything's set. So we'll be standing there with sticky grandkids and overpriced popcorn, having a blast. But what I'm carrying forward, isn't relief about the payment. Of course, I'm relieved. But more important, it's this: aging doesn't announce itself, it accumulates. And if I want to stay close to the woman I've loved for nearly 50 years, I can't just trust autopilot anymore. I need to pause, slow down just a little, and say, "Hey, Sandy, what do you think about this?" Not because I'm incapable, but because I hope I'm wise enough to know I'm not immune to the passage of time. So, thanks a lot for watching this. If you found this meaningful, leave something below in the comments. Hit the subscribe button if you'd like to see more of these videos. Otherwise, take good care of yourself, and we'll talk to you next time.